Muito boa noite. No programa de hoje vamos olhar para o que está a acontecer às nossas vidas no rescaldo da crise. E a pergunta de partida é: o que está a acontecer à Europa em nome da Troika? Nos próximos 50 minutos vai existir uma reportagem fundamental para compreender não só a situação da Grécia, mas também para perceber por que falhou a política de austeridade imposta pela Alemanha. Feitas as contas, a Troika já emprestou mais de 400 mil milhões de euros a Portugal, Grécia, Irlanda e Chipre para manter as economias solventes. E com os credores do seu lado, a Troika tem imposto políticas que estão a destruir o tecido social das nações. O jornalista alemão que preparou este trabalho viajou para Atenas, veio a Lisboa, foi até Nicósia, Bruxelas, Estados Unidos, Londres, falou com figuras de topo, o Nobel de Economia, o diretor do FMI, Varoufakis, o ministro das Finanças da Grécia, e, claro, com pessoas que estão a sentir os efeitos da austeridade. E as conclusões deste jornalista, Harald Schumann, são assustadoras e chocantes.
A vitória eleitoral do partido Syriza na Grécia teve repercussões em toda a Europa. O novo presidente, Alexis Tsipras, tinha prometido ao povo que iria reformar as condições impostas à Grécia pelo Programa Europeu de Assistência Financeira, pois tinham destruído a economia grega e eram vistas como uma forma de opressão. Para o novo ministro das Finanças, Varoufakis, o instrumento desta subjugação tem um nome: Troika. E é por isso que ele está a exigir um novo acordo ao ministro das Finanças alemão, Wolfgang Schäuble.
Europe has an opportunity with our government at the moment. We have been freshly elected. There is an inertia that we're carrying with us from the support that we have from the Greek people for ending the business as usual mentality. And what we are suggesting to our European partners is, you may not like the fact that we were elected because we're a left-wing party, but use us in the context of a European project for turning a page in Greece and turning a page in Europe.
It all began here, in Athens, in the spring of 2010. The Greek state was over-indebted, and the other Euro countries were determined to avoid a bankruptcy. So the Euro finance ministers kept Greece solvent by granting billions in credits in emergency loans from their state coffers. And in exchange, the Greeks had to surrender to an institution that was never foreseen in any European treaty or constitution. The Troika, a joint undertaking of the International Monetary Fund, the European Central Bank and the EU Commission. A small group of unelected officials was empowered to radically change a whole country according to the will of the creditors. And to this day, these officials are not accountable to any parliament.
Durante mais de um ano, o jornalista Harald Schumann seguiu o rastro da Troika em Portugal, Chipre, Irlanda, Bruxelas, Londres, Berlim, Estados Unidos e Grécia. O objetivo do programa da Troika era ajudar países em crise a sair das dívidas excessivas. Mas isso não resultou. A dívida pública é mais elevada do que nunca em todos os países em crise e as economias afundaram ainda mais na recessão e milhões de pessoas perderam o emprego e estão em dificuldades.
Εάν ο Ιπποκράτης ζούσε στις μέρες μας, θα έσκιζε το μανδύα του και βλέπε αυτά με το σύστημα υγείας που γίνονται.
Δηλαδή, ναι, εγώ παραδέχομαι ότι ίσως η χώρα μου χρωστάει, οφείλει, πήρε, έφαγε, δεν ξέρω, εμείς δεν τα φάγαμε όμως.
So the only choice I have is if I don't have a job in June next year, I have to leave.
In 30 or 40 years, we will have lost 4 million citizens in Portugal.
40% of the whole population.
60-70% of the people I know have left.
60-70% of your friends have left?
Gone to Australia and Canada to find work. They can't get it here.
But it's said Ireland is on the rise again. More than 60,000 jobs have been created.
Where? Not in Ireland.
Well, our politicians kept 60% of the people happy. And they fired 40% out on the road, literally, and said to them, we don't need you anymore.
Então o que correu mal? Uma pessoa reconheceu desde cedo os problemas do programa da Troika. O economista Yanis Varoufakis. No verão de 2014, ele não fazia ideia que em breve seria o ministro das Finanças do seu país.
The Troika is visiting our capitals in Dublin, and in Lisbon and in Athens, and is playing the role of Ebenezer Scrooge when it comes to hospitals. It insists that the cleaning ladies of the Ministry of Finance who are on minimum wages should be fired for the purposes of reducing expenditure.
Today, the responsible European leaders, namely the German Chancellor Angela Merkel and her Finance Minister Wolfgang Schäuble, they claim that there was no alternative to the deep cuts in the Greek budget and the corresponding credits because the deficits were simply too high.
If they really wanted to stabilize Greece and stabilize European finance, what they should have done is they should have immediately haircut the Greek government debt. They destabilized finance, they created an unsustainable debt problem, and they turned one proud European nation against the other. This is going to go down in history as one of the most damaging instances in our continent's story.
What you say sounds plausible, but on the other hand, also it sounds a bit like a big conspiracy.
It wasn't a conspiracy, it was a very simple operation. How do we stay in power? Mr. Juncker said it. Once he admitted, we know what needs to be done, we just don't know how to do it and remain in power. Now, don't forget that before 2008, 2010, all parties of government, whether they were Christian Democratic, Social Democratic, it doesn't matter, they had developed this extremely close relationship with the financial sector. There was a kind of Faustian bargain between our politicians and bankers. We will let you do what you want, and you will pay us a small amount per proportion in order to fund our states. So when the crisis hit, which was completely unexpected for them, they had neither the analytical power nor the moral authority to go to this bank and say, you know what, you are out.
A crise na Grécia aconteceu porque durante décadas os governos gastaram mais do que o rendimento disponível. Apesar do rácio da dívida já ser elevado, no início o país beneficiou de baixas taxas de juro quando entrou na eurozona. Isso levou os políticos gregos a criarem milhares de novos empregos para os apoiantes dos seus partidos e a financiar projetos de prestígio, como os Jogos Olímpicos, com empréstimos ainda maiores, que bancos por toda a Europa fizeram sem pensar duas vezes. Os estádios que agora estão decadentes custaram a cerca de 7 mil milhões de euros. Ainda gastaram mais dinheiro em armamento. A Grécia, um país pequeno, tinha, em proporção com a sua população, o maior orçamento de defesa da NATO. As fábricas francesas e alemãs fizeram milhares de milhões ao vender aos gregos tanques, fragatas e submarinos, chegando a usar subornos para garantir os negócios. A Alemanha e a França foram as vencedoras no que toca ao aumento da dívida grega. Mas quando a Grécia estava finalmente à beira da insolvência em 2010, os governos de Berlim e Paris não quiseram saber das responsabilidades partilhadas dos seus bancos e daqueles que pagaram os subornos.
Smart people in Brussels, especially in Frankfurt and of course in Berlin, knew in May of 2010 that Greece would never repay its debts. What they did was to pretend that the Greek government was not insolvent, but it had a liquidity problem, and to give the largest loan in human history to the most insolvent of states, pretending and extending as if they are third-rate corrupt bankers, was a crime against humanity. Because what it did, it locked Greece into permanent indebtedness that can never be repaid, and turned one proud European nation against another, because the struggling German worker, who is more or less on the poverty line, even though he or she is working 8-10 hours a day, was told by its government that, you know, we are cutting down on your hospitals, but we're giving 110, 230 billion to the Greeks, when it wasn't true that the money was going to the Greeks. This money was never given to any of the Greeks. It was given to the bankers, and most of this money to French and German bankers. They lied to the Greek people and to the German people. They said to the Greek people, we have avoided bankruptcy, and they said to the German people that the Greeks, they were wayward, Now we're going to punish them with austerity, but we will lend them the money because European solidarity demands that.
Washington, Fundo Monetário Internacional. Os peritos têm experiência em gerir crises de dívidas. Foi por isso que os Estados-membros chamaram o FMI para ser credor. As decisões sobre empréstimos são tomadas pelos diretores executivos, que representam os Estados-membros. No entanto, quando a Grécia foi posta na agenda, houve resistência no FMI. Paulo Nogueira Batista, diretor executivo pelo Brasil e membro do Conselho de 24 pessoas, fala pelos críticos.
I don't speak on behalf of the IMF, but in a personal capacity. Greece would have been better off with an upfront debt restructuring. The big issue that arose at the time in the IMF was because under the rules, this could only be done if the debt could be perceived as sustainable, meaning payable according to schedule. And the IMF staff was very reluctant to say that outright. So what happened, and this was a pretty bad moment for the IMF, was that the rules were changed to suit the situation.
The internal rules of the IMF were changed overnight only because of Greece?
What disturbed me at the time in particular was the fact that the rules were changed in a non-transparent manner. In the sense that you had to look very carefully at a very extensive report to see that the rules are being changed.
It was not an item on the agenda.
It was not explicitly on the agenda, so it was a very bad move, I would say. At a cost, of course, because the cost is reputational.
Mas por que é que os europeus organizaram este golpe de Estado silencioso no FMI? O antigo conselheiro do presidente da Comissão Europeia, Durão Barroso, esteve muito próximo de quem tomou as decisões.
The IMF staff were overruled by the managing director of the IMF, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, who had ambitions to be French president and didn't want to impose losses on French banks. And at the same time, German banks furiously lobbied Angela Merkel that it would be deeply damaging to impose losses on them. As a result of that, the Eurozone governments decided to pretend that Greece was merely going through temporary funding difficulties and to bypass the legal basis on which the euro was founded, the no bailout rule, and lend money to Greece, not in order to bail out the Greek government, but in order to bail out the French and German banks that had recklessly lent to an insolvent Greek government.
Do you know the volume, how much money was involved from the German and French bank side?
French banks own 20 billion euros worth and German banks 17 billion euros worth.
Então foi por isso que a Grécia foi impedida de ter uma imediata reestruturação da dívida. Os responsáveis tinham noção das implicações desde o início. O delegado da Grécia no FMI, na altura, tem provas.
The missing element in this program was debt restructuring.
Debt restructuring means debt relief? Or...
Debt relief and private sector involvement.
Yes.
So the Europeans had to impose to Greece a very severe fiscal adjustment program for a short period, 3 to 4 years. And the IMF experts had from the beginning doubts about the success of the program because of this short fiscal adjustment period. I remember that in March 2010, the IMF experts sent an email to the European Commission. If you want, I can read what the experts were saying in March 2010. This adjustment will cause a sharp contraction in domestic demand and an attendant deep recession, severely stretching the social fabric. They were saying that from the beginning.
But doesn't this mean that Greece has been sacrificed for the sake of the stability of the global financial markets?
I fully agree with you, yeah.
So this used to be a very busy shopping area. As you can see, every second shop has now gone out of business.
It's one of the very few symbols of crisis. No? Usually you don't see it, yeah?
It's true that it's difficult to locate the crisis, to see the crisis. It's not so visible, and the main reason is that you have an enormous network of solidarity between the people and the families, so it's not very visible.
Κύριε Κώστα, Mr. Kostas apologized for not having any light into the store. That the store is in this state.
How long it is empty?
20 μήνες. Το ενοίκιο εδώ ήταν 900 ευρώ.
The rent here, the monthly rent used to be 900 euros.
800, 700, 600, τώρα 500.
And even with 500, that is almost half the price, nobody is renting.
What's the future for this year?
Τι να κάνουμε τώρα, αφού λέει, έρχεται ο άλλος και 400 ευρώ το δίνω. Δεν υπάρχει ζήτηση, έτσι. Δεν υπάρχει ζήτηση έξω. Δεν υπάρχουν άνθρωποι που να έχουν τα μετρητά.
Καλύτερα λοιπόν να το πουλήσετε ή να το χαρίσετε.
Να το χαρίσω, ναι, αλλά να το πουλήσεις δεν πουλιέται. Πώς θα, τι να πουλήσω.
Before the crisis, before the austerity took effect, it was possible, I guess, to claim that austerity would actually be good for the economy. There were people making that argument, but now we have, now we have experience, and it's overwhelmingly the case that austerity, in fact, does cause economies to shrink, and it causes them to shrink by more than 1 for 1.
What was the result of that for the European economy?
There's a dramatically clear correlation between austerity and economic downturns. And so the economies are shrunk.
Even worse.
What people find very hard to understand, if I may say what Germans seem to find particularly hard to understand, is that the economy is a circle, right? Money flows around. You buy from me, I buy from you. My spending is your income, your spending is my income. If you say, well, people must spend less, if everybody spends less at the same time, then incomes fall. So when you say, well, we're going to, the private sector we know is over-indebted, it's having to cut back, and we're saying, okay, now the public sector also has to cut back, who is supposed to, who are we selling to? Where is, this cannot work if everyone does it at the same time.
Why then it is done?
Germany looks at its experience and says, well, we did austerity in 1999, 2000. Germany was actually kind of a troubled economy in the late 1990s, and it pulled back, and Germany is doing fine now. And so why can't everyone else do the same? And of course, to that, the answer is, well, Germany was doing okay because it was able to run massive trade surpluses. And it was able to run massive trade surpluses because there was this great debt-financed boom in places like Spain. And now Germany is saying to Spain, you do what we did, but we won't do what you did. It's not risk. But Germany, just looking at its own experiences, thinks that austerity works, not realizing that the context matters.
A Troika tomou com frequência decisões arbitrárias. Obrigou a Grécia a fazer uma coisa que os governos que lhe deram mandato nunca fariam nos seus próprios países. Reduzir a despesa no setor da saúde para 6% da produção económica. A média na Europa é de 8% e na Alemanha é de 10%. Ao mesmo tempo, a economia contraiu tão drasticamente que o orçamento para a saúde foi cortado em 30%. As consequências foram desastrosas. Cerca de 3 milhões de pessoas, 1/4 da população, está sem seguro de saúde e não recebe qualquer cuidado de saúde. Mais de 200 hospitais foram fechados. Metade dos 5 mil médicos das clínicas de saúde públicas foram despedidos. Uma catástrofe médica. Centenas de milhares não encontram médicos em clínicas públicas que os tratem. É por isso que voluntários por toda a Grécia criaram clínicas provisórias para aliviar o pior sofrimento. 100 médicos voluntários, 200 ajudantes, trabalham nesta clínica provisória em Atenas, no tempo livre. Felizmente, cidadãos da Alemanha e da Áustria ajudam com donativos num ato de solidariedade europeia que os seus governos se recusam a praticar.
In our media, it has been said the Greek healthcare system is inefficient, has a lot of overcapacity, the doctors are corrupt. That's reported in Germany.
Ήταν ένα δημόσιο σύστημα υγείας που ήθελε μεγάλες μεταρρυθμίσεις και βαθιές μεταρρυθμίσεις, αλλά ήθελε φτιάξιμο, όχι καταστροφή. Αυτό αυτό που συνέβη στη χώρα μας δεν ήταν να φτιαχτεί ένα δημόσιο σύστημα υγείας εκεί που έπασχε και που είχε τα ελαττώματα που ήταν αρκετά. Αυτό που έγινε ήταν ό,τι καλό υπήρχε να το γκρεμίσουν και σήμερα στη χώρα μου, στην Ελλάδα, να μην υπάρχει ουσιαστικά δημόσιο σύστημα υγείας. Σε πανελλήνια κλίμακα πεθαίνουν εκατοντάδες άνθρωποι σήμερα. Και όταν λέω εκατοντάδες άνθρωποι εννοώ κάθε μήνα, όχι εκατοντάδες άνθρωποι σε ένα χρόνο. Και πεθαίνουν και αυτός ο αριθμός δεν καταγράφεται από κανένα. Αλλά το ξέρουμε εμείς οι γιατροί. Γιατί ένας άρρωστος ο οποίος δεν έχει πρόσβαση στο δημόσιο σύστημα υγείας είναι καταδικασμένος να πεθάνει. Η Τρόικα πολύ συχνά μας λέει ότι δεν ευθύνομαι εγώ, η ελληνική κυβέρνηση δεν τα κάνει σωστά, η ελληνική κυβέρνηση ή ο κάποιος, ο τάδε ή ο δίνα υπουργός είναι αυτός ο οποίος δεν έχει κάνει σωστά τη δουλειά του. Εάν διαβάσει όμως κανείς τα μνημόνια, από το πρώτο μέχρι το τελευταίο, θα δει ότι οτιδήποτε έχει συμβεί στον χώρο της υγείας, μα οτιδήποτε έχει συμβεί, ακόμα και στην τελευταία απόλυση, είτε γιατρού είτε νοσηλευτικού προσωπικού, ήταν γραμμένο μέσα στα μνημόνια, ήταν δέσμευση της Τρόικα. Γιατί εφαρμόζονται αυτά τα μέτρα? Είναι επειδή έχουμε οικονομικό πρόβλημα? Είναι επειδή είναι ανίκανοι? Επειδή είναι ανόητοι? Όχι, τίποτα από αυτά δεν είναι. Έχουν μία ιδεολογία. Όποιος έχει χρήματα ζει, όποιος δεν έχει χρήματα πεθαίνει.
Os membros da Troika não tinham escrúpulos quando se tratava de doentes. Mas olharam para o lado quando as elites ricas enganaram o Estado. Em outubro de 2010, a ministra francesa das Finanças, Christine Lagarde, entregou ao seu colega grego uma lista com mais de 2.000 nomes de cidadãos gregos que tinham contas na Suíça. Só neste banco, o HSBC, gregos ricos tinham escondido mais de 2.000 milhões, mas tanto o ministro grego como os membros da Troika mantiveram a existência da lista em segredo, impedindo qualquer investigação. Em 2012, alguém passou a lista a um jornalista e desde então ficou conhecida como a lista Lagarde. Hoje em dia, Christine Lagarde é a diretora-geral do FMI.
Η λίστα Lagarde, όπως την ονομάζουμε στην Ελλάδα, ήρθε στη χώρα το 2010 το Σεπτέμβριο.
How many of these potential tax evaders have been prosecuted until today?
Είναι 2.062 συνολικά τα ονόματα. Το Γενάρη του 2014, ο επικεφαλής του ΣΔΟΕ, που είναι στενός φίλος του Πρωθυπουργού, μας είπε ότι είχαν ολοκληρωθεί οι έλεγχοι μόνον σε 6. Απαράδεκτο, αδιανόητο αποτέλεσμα, το οποίο όμως είναι ευεξήγητο, διότι μέσα στη λίστα αυτή, στους καταθέτες αυτούς, βρίσκονται πολιτικά πρόσωπα, συγγενείς πολιτικών προσώπων, μια σειρά προσώπων συνδεδεμένων με αυτό που συνιστά το σύστημα της διαπλοκής στην Ελλάδα του σήμερα.
But was it not one of the main objectives of the Troika's reform program for Greece to stop the tax evasion of the rich?
It was only on paper. It was only on paper, and what was a very stunning revelation during the procedures before the committee investigating the Lagarde list case was the fact that the IMF official who was permanently installed at the Ministry of Finance during the time basically discouraged the public officials from looking more into the case and looking more into the list.
Os ricos permanecem livres de impostos. Foram-lhes oferecidas propriedades do Estado a preços ridiculamente baixos. Por exemplo, a área de Ellinikon, em Atenas, o local do velho aeroporto e mais tarde dos Estados Olímpicos, 3 vezes o tamanho do Mónaco, 4 quilómetros de praias e linha de costa. Uma terra muito desejável para a construção. Mas o fundo da Troika fez o leilão de tal maneira que só restou um licitador. A empresa Lambda, que pertence ao oligarca grego Spiros Latsis, visto aqui a promover uma revenda lucrativa à indústria turística. A Lambda comprou o local por menos de metade do valor estimado de 1,24 mil milhões.
it's looting. It's actually, unfortunately, a small group is looting the country. There's only one bidder.
But it is a privatization process where there's only one bidder. Usually, if you have only one bidder, you would interrupt the process and say, okay, we sell it 2 years later.
But not in Greece, under the Troika.
Who then benefits from the sale of the Hellenikon area? Who are those investors?
Ο κύριος Λάτσης, που μέσω της Lambda Development φαίνεται να αποκτά το ελληνικό, ο κύριος Λάτσης όμως είναι ταυτόχρονα το πρόσωπο που υπήρξε ο ιδιοκτήτης, ας το πούμε έτσι, της Eurobank, είναι ταυτόχρονα ο συνδεδεμένος με τον όμιλο EFG, ο οποίος συνδέεται με την μεγαλύτερη τραπεζική κατάθεση, μη διαλευκανθήσα κατάθεση, που εμφανίστηκε στη λίστα Lagarde.
Why does the Troika not intervene in this process? They could, or couldn't they?
Η Τρόικα ουσιαστικά συμπράττει με αυτήν την εγκληματική πολιτική σε βάρος του δημοσίου συμφέροντος, σε βάρος των Ελλήνων πολιτών, σε βάρος της ελληνικής κοινωνίας και θα σας πω και σε várος των επόμενων γενεών.
A Troika impôs as chamadas reformas estruturais nos países em crise. Neste caso, também seguiram a ideologia simplista. Segundo eles, as pessoas estão desempregadas porque os salários são muito elevados ou porque a proteção do emprego é demasiado rígida. Em Portugal, tornou-se muito mais fácil despedir funcionários, as indenizações foram abolidas, os salários baixaram até 20% e o caráter vinculativo dos contratos coletivos de trabalho foi desmantelado.
When the financial crisis began, almost half of the Portuguese workers were under a signed collective contract. Now, less than 6% of those workers have a social contract. They have only individual contracts. So they are totally vulnerable to all pressure and to distinctions of wages and so on.
The system of collective bargaining has been dismantled?
Totally, totally. From half to less than 1/20th.
Este programa tinha como objetivo estimular a economia e agradar aos patrões. Mas ajudou realmente as empresas?
Os salários em Portugal não são elevados. Chamo a atenção para o próprio valor do salário mínimo, que em Portugal são 485 euros, e, de facto, os salários baixos foi uma prática que se utilizou em Portugal para um modelo de desenvolvimento que está ultrapassado.
What exactly did you say when you met with the Troika officials, probably?
Foi isso que dissemos à Troika, repetimos em todas as avaliações. A Troika limitou-se a escutar, mas tenho que confessar que pouco fez daquilo que nos ouviu sugerir.
Sogar der hiesige Präsident des Arbeitgeberverbandes sagte uns, dass die Lohnkosten und das Arbeitsrecht eigentlich gar nicht das Problem seiner Mitgliedsunternehmen wären.
Viele dieser Arbeitsmarktreformen waren sehr hilfreich für die Wettbewerbsfähigkeit der Unternehmungen. Aber es geht nicht nur um Arbeitskosten und Arbeitsrecht.
Eigentlich sollten die Arbeitsmarktreformen ja dafür sorgen, dass mehr Menschen Arbeit finden. Aber im wirklichen Leben ist dann oft das Gegenteil passiert. Also wir haben zum Beispiel mit dem Fahrer eines großen Transportunternehmens gesprochen. Und er hat erzählt, naja, ich verdiene jetzt viel weniger als vorher.
Os trabalhadores chegavam à possibilidade, portanto, teriam a possibilidade de ver, portanto, no final do mês, 1.300, 1.400 euros. Estamos a falar num ponto de partida de 600, que é o salário médio do motorista. Chegavam a ter a capacidade, portanto, muito por via do tempo suplementar e, portanto, agora chegam aos 900.
Ist denn wenigstens der Arbeitgeber glücklich damit und investiert in neue Busse oder neue Linien?
Não há. Como eu disse, acaba por estar uma coisa relacionada com a outra, ou seja, esta redução no pagamento do tempo suplementar não permitiu fazer novas admissões, mas sim aumentar mais o volume de trabalho daqueles que existem.
Hat nicht dann diese Art von Arbeitsmarktreform, die dafür einfach sorgt, dass die Leute für weniger Geld mehr arbeiten müssen, genau den gegenteiligen Effekt? Also senkt Beschäftigung statt steigert Beschäftigung?
Das ist, was die Wirtschaft schlussendlich braucht, um wettbewerbsfähig zu sein.
Aber ich meine, ich hätte in Ihren Berichten gelesen, die Löhne sind bisher um durchschnittlich 8% gesunken, aber sie seien noch nicht genug gesunken. Man muss sich ja überlegen, wenn dann macht Portugal das und dann machen die Konkurrenzländer das und so entfaltet sich dann europaweit oder womöglich weltweit so eine Art Lohnsenkungswettlauf, was die Amerikaner Race to the Bottom nennen. Also wo ist denn dann mal Schluss? Also wann verdienen denn die Arbeitnehmer mal wenig genug, dass man sagen muss, also hier muss jetzt mal Schluss sein?
In der Situation, in der sich Portugal im Moment befindet, muss die Wettbewerbsfähigkeit des Landes hergestellt werden.
I used to work in a travel agency.
But this has closed.
No, but I was the youngest there, so I was the natural
the youngest
choice.
is the first to be dismissed.
And now I am unemployed.
I'm unemployed too.
And what was your profession before?
An agronomic engineer.
Mm-hmm.
Most of jobs I can try to find are less paid than my own unemployment benefit right now.
It's unbearable. I can't afford to have a child and earning 550 euros a month. I barely can afford to support myself.
Everything is around 400 euros, 500 maximum.
So what's on offer are jobs for a minimum wage, more or less?
Most jobs don't even pay that much. If you're gonna see the ads you have, if you're gonna calculate everything, you won't even get that.
It's totally common to see a qualified job for 500 euros.
Even for an academic?
Even for an academic, of course.
All the families have invested a lot in what was considered to be, and it was, the most difficult Portuguese problem, that was qualification of human resources. So we invested in university degrees and we made huge progress, but all of a sudden there is no jobs for any of those youngsters.
Even if they are highly qualified?
Particularly if they are highly qualified, and then because you are squeezing wages at the same time, you don't invest, there are no jobs, so they just immigrate. So this is a pure brain drain, and we are killing the conditions for future growth.
As políticas da Troika estão a levar os cidadãos a saírem do seu país. Fazem fila à porta dos consulados. Mas a Troika podia ter agido de uma outra maneira, completamente diferente. Por exemplo, limitando os lucros exorbitantes feitos pelos operadores privados das pontes e autoestradas. Mas nessa área, nada aconteceu de importante, disse Carlos Moreno, antigo juiz do Tribunal de Contas. Quando o Tribunal Constitucional declarou que o programa de austeridade era inconstitucional, os juízes foram caracterizados como ativistas políticos pela Comissão Europeia. A advogada e deputada Isabel Moreira ficou enfurecida. Também na Irlanda, o país modelo para a Troika, é o cidadão comum que está a pagar o preço. Enquanto isso, como nos disse o economista irlandês James Stewart, empresas como a Apple e a Google fizeram cerca de 31 mil milhões de euros de lucro livre de impostos em 2011. Estão a cuidar dos poderosos. E são as pessoas comuns que estão a carregar o fardo. A Troika ordenou despedimentos em massa na Grécia. Então também as 595 senhoras de limpeza que trabalhavam para as autoridades fiscais foram despedidas. Elas têm protestado há meses. Dizem que esta situação só dá lucros às empresas privadas de limpeza. Além disso, o salário mínimo baixou drasticamente, sob coação.
Κοιτάξτε, νομίζω ότι υπήρχε η άποψη της Τρόικα αλλά και της κυβέρνησης και του τότε Πρωθυπουργού του κ. Παπαδήμου, ο οποίος υποστήριζε ότι ο κατώτατος μισθός των 751 ευρώ ακαθάριστα ήταν πολύ υψηλός σε σχέση με το επίπεδο παραγωγικότητας της ελληνικής οικονομίας και επομένως έπρεπε να μειωθεί. Τα συνδικάτα αλλά και οι εργοδότες διαφωνούσαν. Υπάρχει ένα μνημόνιο προς την τότε κυβέρνηση. Είναι ακριβώς αυτό εδώ το κείμενο, το οποίο το έχουν υπογράψει όλοι οι κοινωνικοί εταίροι, εδώ βλέπετε. Αυτό δεν ελήφθηκε υπόψη. Ο κατώτατος μισθός μειώθηκε, έγινε με πράξη νομοθετικού περιεχομένου και δεν πέρασε μέσα από το Ελληνικό Κοινοβούλιο.
It was not voted by the Parliament?
Δεν πέρασε από το Ελληνικό Κοινοβούλιο γιατί ίσως φοβόντουσαν ότι οι βουλευτές δεν θα το ψηφίσουν.
Esta redução de 4,31 euros para 3,44 à hora levou 3,5 milhões de famílias para uma pobreza ainda mais profunda. O novo governo quer recuperar o valor antigo.
Εδώ, living room, TV, perfect.
Wenn Sie sich die Entwicklung in Griechenland ansehen, so hat unter anderem, nicht nur, aber unter anderem der exzessiv hohe Mindestlohn dazu geführt, dass im exponierten Sektor, im exportorientierten Sektor, es fast keine Beschäftigung mehr gab.
Natürlich waren die Gewerkschaften dagegen. Aber das Interessante war, auch sämtliche Arbeitgeberverbände.
Ich glaube, das sehen Sie falsch.
Der zuständige Arbeitsminister wollte es dann auch nicht machen und hat uns berichtet, dass dann eben die Vertreter der Troika in der gemeinsamen Kabinettssitzung gesagt haben, also entweder ihr macht das oder wir zahlen die nächste Tranche nicht aus. Das war Politik per Erpressung. Ist sowas nicht auch ein Machtmissbrauch?
Die Behauptung, dass der griechische Mindestlohn keinerlei ökonomischen Auswirkungen hatte und seine Beseitigung oder seine Senkung negative ökonomische Auswirkungen hätte, ist absoluter Unsinn. Da werden Sie von den griechischen Kollegen ganz einfach hinters Licht geführt.
Naja, also wenn das nur Gewerkschafter wären, dann wäre ich ja auch selber misstrauisch. Aber wenn es auch die ganz normalen, wenn man so will, Bankökonomen oder Ökonomen der Unternehmerverbände sind, die sagen, das hat alles nur schlimmer gemacht, dann komme ich doch ins Zweifeln.
Also ich habe sowohl vom griechischen Finanzminister als auch von einer ganzen Reihe von griechischen Ökonomen was anderes gehört.
Lohnfestsetzung, Tarifverträge, das Arbeitsmarktreform, Arbeitsmarktliberalisierung ist in allen Krisenländern Teil der Sanierungsprogramme. Und das Interessante daran ist, dass ja im geltenden europäischen Vertrag festgelegt ist, dass die EU-Kommission genau für Lohnfindung und Tarifverträge und Collective Bargaining nicht zuständig ist. Wie kann es sein, dass dieselben Kommissionsbeamten, die als Kommission dafür nicht zuständig sind, als Vertreter in der Troika sich mit dem Ding befassen, also und dort eigentlich das Gegenteil tun von dem, was ihnen der EU-Vertrag aufträgt? Ist das nicht Vertragsbruch im Auftrag der Eurogruppe?
Jetzt stelle ich Ihnen, ich nehme an, Sie wissen es genau und stellen daher eher suffisanterweise diese Frage. All das, was in diesen Krisenländern passiert ist, war ja nicht eine Aktivität im Rahmen des normalen EU-Gesetzgebungsverfahrens, sondern waren Maßnahmen, die im Rahmen der Eurogruppe, im Rahmen der Eurozone erfolgt sind. Und sie waren dort nicht als legislatives Organ oder legislativ vorbereitendes Organ, sondern als Experten für die Eurogruppe unterwegs.
According to the EU treaty, is it possible to differentiate it as the same person in these two different roles?
No, I would definitely say no. The Commission is a guardian of the treaty. The Commission always have to respect the treaty. It's not because the Commission is part of the Troika that it can say, oh, well, we put the treaty aside because we're part of the Troika and the Troika can do this and that. No, it can't. The Commission should, in all circumstances, respect the treaty. And for me, it's very clear that they didn't.
Foi uma das muitas entradas na zona cinzenta da legalidade. Em Atenas, os membros da Troika até se comportaram como se fossem legisladores e chantagearam os ministros.
Dear Minister, we have serious problem. Tax is not acceptable. Key indispensable provisions are absent. Very many comments, proposals have been ignored.
Look here, completely lined out and redrafted.
Even the last word, except that we were elected officials and they were bureaucrats and technocrats.
13 μήνες έμεινα υπουργός, όλη μου το είναι και η φροντίδα και η έγνοια ήταν πώς θα γίνουν οι διαπραγματεύσεις με την Τρόικα. Ο Τόμσεν για μένα ήταν ένας εξαιρετικός διαπραγματευτής.
How did they treat you as the elected minister?
Ας πούμε, εκβίαζε. Συνέχεια αισθανόμουν ότι η χώρα μου ταπεινωνόταν. Αυτό που είπε ένα βράδυ που με φώναξε στις 11 η ώρα για συζήτηση. Από σένα εξαρτάται αν θα πάρει η Ελλάδα 8 δισεκατομμύρια τη δόση.
This was only because the IMF and Mr. Thompson needed a symbol of defeat.
Yes. And the fear.
And the fear.
The fear. Τον φόβο ήθελε. Και την υποταγή. Δεν σεβότανε ότι είχε έναν υπουργό απέναντί του μιας κυρίαρχης χώρας. Μου έδινε την εντύπωση στην negotiation ότι εγώ ήμουνα ο εκπρόσωπος μιας χώρας που δεν ήταν απλώς ο φιλέτης, αλλά ήταν μια φαυλοκρατική χώρα. Μια χώρα τεμπέλιδων. Εγώ πιστεύω ότι ο Τόμσεν το πήρε προσωπικά αυτό το θέμα. Και ήθελε και εκδίκηση να πάρει και ταπείνωση να κάνει και να δικαιώσει τον εαυτό του.
The worst thing that can happen to a country is to fall into the hands of international bureaucracies that know better what the country needs to do. No? And, for example, even to this day, the extent of intervention in Greece is amazing. The Troika has designed a program for Greece that is such a detailed program. It's a complete government program.
Isn't it generally very risky to grant so much power to unelected officials? They can do what they want.
I think that's a big, big issue. It's a big issue in the context of Europe because you have these, what de Gaulle called the technocratie apatride, in Brussels taking decisions, unelected officials. You have here in Washington international bureaucracies. I'm not excluding myself there. We're so distant from the problems. I have never been to Greece, so I haven't seen the problems in the field. And this is a dangerous situation for a country to have so many of its decisions, crucial for the future of its citizens, in the hands of people that are not in touch.
Having unelected, unaccountable, and very often incompetent officials in Brussels taking decisions about people from which they are detached and to whom they are not accountable doesn't work. So, if you're Angela Merkel, you take policy decisions which impose suffering on Greek people or Portuguese people, and ultimately you're only accountable to German voters. And if you're working for the European Commission, you have a job for life and you're accountable to your boss, but certainly not for any suffering you might cause.
O Chipre foi o último país que teve de ser resgatado, na primavera de 2013, porque os bancos tinham perdido o dinheiro com empréstimos à Grécia. Desta vez, ao contrário dos outros resgates, os outros Estados-membros obrigaram os depositantes e credores dos bancos a cobrirem as perdas. Mas depois aconteceu uma coisa estranha. Os bancos cipriotas tiveram de vender as suas filiais gregas a um preço extremamente baixo a um banco grego em particular. 3 semanas depois, esse banco pôde registrar um lucro de 3,4 mil milhões de euros. É por isso que muitos cipriotas se sentem roubados.
When Cyprus needed emergency loans from the other Euro countries in March 2013, the Troika set as a condition the sale of the Greek branches of the Cypriot banks. What did that mean for the Cypriots?
That meant that immediately the 2 biggest banks in Cyprus became insolvent.
How that?
Because we gave away the branches in Greece for free. They were worth 4 billion. But a decision was taken essentially on the European level, on the European Union level, to force us to sell those branches for 500 million. So when this decision was taken, we lost 3.5 billion euros. That meant that the bank that got the branches, Piraeus Bank, made a profit of 3.5 billion euros. These losses were immediately borne by the Cypriot depositors of the banks, whereas the Greek depositors of the Cypriot branches did not suffer any consequences.
Who exactly took this decision?
The Eurogroup, the Troika in Greece, and the Troika in Cyprus, together with the central banks.
That would mean that the Eurogroup decide on purpose to expropriate Cypriots and transfer the wealth to the Greek side?
They took the money from the Cypriot depositors and they gave it to a Greek bank. That is precisely what happened. In my view, it's one of the biggest scandals in the history of the Eurozone. Some people made billions out of this transaction.
But didn't also the Cypriot parliament and the Cypriot government agree to this deal?
Yes, with a gun to our head. We were forced to agree to this deal because we were bankrupt.
But what you say is a very strong allegation against the responsible ministers from the other Euro countries and the ECB and the Commission.
Let me just be very clear. What happened in Cyprus was daylight robbery, but on a state level. And I repeat, some people made billions out of this transaction. Piraeus Bank, of course. The owner of Piraeus Bank, Mr. Salas, had non-performing loans with one of the banks that was sold. Over 150 million in loans. Those loans were written off after the transaction. So we gave them our money. It's as simple as that.
The decision was taken, and that meant they showed a profit of 3 billion overnight.
Yes, but it meant that on the Greek side, a bank which was insolvent was overnight rescued? Isn't that very, very unjust?
Yes, and they put it to us very, very bluntly. The alternative was we either agreed to this program, meaning that we would have a haircut of depositors and, of course, all kinds of other elements of the program, or basically we would have to leave the Eurozone. That meant a full catastrophe for the economy. So in a very, very real sense, this was do or die.
There's a strong indication that the accusation is true, that the ECB and the EU Commission handed over billions to the Greek side. This email by an official from the European Commission is evidence that they demanded this extremely low selling price. And this calculation was the basis on which the decision was made by the European Council, which gave the Cypriot minister no other choice than to accept the terms and sell. Only a month later, the buyer, the Greek bank Piraeus, could report in its quarterly results that its equity has increased by 3.4 billion euros. And they even say that it was because of the acquisition of the Cypriot assets, because otherwise the Piraeus bank would have been insolvent. Did the Troika collude with the Greek bank? This suspicion is now even being investigated in the board of the Central Bank of Cyprus.
You talk about 10% of the country's GDP that was transferred outside Cyprus through this sale. It is mess. I mean, the public wants transparency. Mistakes were made. Someone has to pay the price. But it seems the price that was decided was excessive, and it was paid by the smaller player in the game. And there is not enough information to judge if mistakes were made or if there was corruption. So these questions, these question marks, cannot be hanging over European institutions. So I think it's more important that there is some, at the European level, an investigation of what went wrong.
A maior parte dos membros do Parlamento Europeu viu o que estava a acontecer durante anos, sem nada fazer. Após uma curta investigação, tudo o que fizeram foi queixarem-se da sua falta de poder. Mas as pessoas responsáveis não tiveram de prestar contas.
Werden Sie sich denn jetzt im neuen Parlament, was ja gerade gewählt worden ist, für weitere Untersuchungen von zurückliegenden Fällen einsetzen?
Es gab keine Untersuchung und es wird keinen Untersuchungsausschuss geben, weil es keinen Anlass für einen Untersuchungsausschuss gibt. Was wir getan haben...
Das sehen viele Kritiker anders.
Verstehe ich, aber man muss auch die Kompetenz dazu haben.
Ja, gibt es denn gar keine Möglichkeit, die Verantwortlichen zur Rechenschaft zu ziehen für die Fehler, die gemacht wurden?
Ich bleibe dabei. Die Tätigkeit der Troika war ein großer Erfolg. Die Tätigkeit der Troika war notwendig, das sagt auch das Parlament mit einer breiten Mehrheit. Und zur Arbeit der Troika gab es nahezu keine Alternative. Wir müssen die Lehren aus den Fehlentwicklungen, die Lehren aus der Tätigkeit ziehen. Aber rückwirkend muss man sagen, das war die einzige Möglichkeit, die wir hatten, und die Erfolge geben uns auch recht.
To my mind, it is precisely this attitude which is inciting people against this Europe.
Por isso é que os gregos elegeram um governo que se opõe a isto. Se os senhores da Europa se recusam a admitir os seus erros, estão a pôr em perigo todos os avanços conseguidos com a União Europeia. A ideia da Europa costuma encerrar a ideia de esperança para um futuro europeu. O que está agora sob ameaça?
Of course, the burden of the crisis could be distributed more fairly. Of course, those responsible could be held to account. And of course, it would be possible after the fiasco of the programs to abandon austerity and create, with new investments, a future for the crisis countries. Why didn't this happen?
Os responsáveis do FMI, BCE, Comissão Europeia, recusaram responder a qualquer das nossas perguntas.